Hi guys, it's Maynard. It's Tuesday, and so you know what time it is. Today we're going to have a fantastic show. I say that every week, but wow, are we lucky today. Today's guest is Dan Yergin. So many of you know Dan, but just to hit on some of the key points, Dan is Vice Chairman of IHS Markets. He is an acclaimed author. He's been an advisor to so many presidents, so many governments, so many companies. He's obviously the founder of CIRA. And when we thought of an expert who might be able to tell us how to make sense of all this, we couldn't think of anybody better than Dan Yergin. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you very much, Maynard, and I'm very pleased to join you and all of your viewers.
Well, we're really lucky to have you. I think we thought we would kick off. We're going to do 3 teasers for you. We've got our usual crew here, my co-host Mike Bradley, Colin Fenton up in the Boston area, and Matt Portillo at an undisclosed location. But each of you guys will ask you for your headline of the week, because at the end, after we talk to Dan, we're going to circle back to you guys and ask you to put a little more color and meat on your headline of the week. So Mike Bradley, headline of the week.
Crude oil markets continue to surprise the upside because the physical markets are tightening.
Matt Portillo, headline of the week.
Natural gas pricing may have some risk heading into the summer.
And Colin Fenton, what you got?
We learned one great lesson in the Great Depression, and we're nervous that we may be about to repeat that mistake, and it's not monetary policy or fiscal policy.
Okay. Well, Dan, thank you again so much for joining us. I think the first place we thought we might start was just, you've seen a number of downturns. You've been a student of and a professor of the industry. How should we put this downturn in context? Is there a right way to think about it, or a right way to at least frame it up? Because it seems so unique.
Well, it is unique. It's, the word you keep hearing all the time is unprecedented, and this is unprecedented. You look at the previous price collapse in 86, 98, even 2014, 2015, and even though the price went down, demand went up. This is a huge demand shock. It's a government mandated demand shock in response to the virus. And in a way, the only analogy is just what was referred to, the Great Depression, when you had that flood of oil in Texas that took oil down to 10 cents a barrel, which we calculate to be about $1.70 today, I think in today's money. And that too was a demand shock. That demand shock was the Great Depression. This demand shock is the coronavirus.
So Dan, you've seen OPEC and players, global players, react to crises before. What did you make of the OPEC Plus initial problems and subsequent ability to come to something? What's your take on all that?
OPEC Plus, of course, was a reaction to the 2014-2015 price collapse. And it began when the Russians didn't want to play ball. And OPEC, Ali Naimi, the Saudi minister, said, well, we'll leave it to the market. Prices went down. And so in 2016, OPEC Plus was born. And that was really the leadership of Russia and Saudi Arabia together. That was starting to come unglued as we went through 2019. And then it got to first week of March 2020. And that's where it blew up. And it blew up because the Saudis wanted deeper cuts. And the Russian view is, well, let's not do anything yet. Let's extend the agreement. Let's see what happens. Let's wait until this coronavirus starts going over the rest of the world. They simply did not agree, fell apart. And so you had the beginning of a price war, a battle for market share at exactly the time you were moving from a situation, the first phase of the corona crisis, which was a 6 million barrel a day decline, primarily China shutting down, to what in April became a 30 million barrel a day. So they were increasing supply into a market that was really disappearing. But I think when we then got to the middle of April and the President of the United States got involved, that told us that we're again in a new configuration in the oil market, one that reflected the current reality, one that reflected the shale revolution in the United States. Because today, the world market, the 3 predominant powers, are the big 3, and that's the United States, that's Russia, and that's Saudi Arabia. And we saw something that could not have been really imagined before, where the United States was really the mediator that brought it all together and got this very substantial agreement by those OPEC plus countries to cut production.
So were you surprised that the Russians were resistant and then ultimately participated? And were you surprised at the level of the U.S. participation, either directly or indirectly?
Well, I think here's another time we can use the word unprecedented. There's never been anything like the U.S. Is really the U.S. It was President Trump. It was the Secretary of State, Pompeo. It was the Secretary of Energy, Briette. And it was with some very active participation by some very important U.S. senators that made this happen, that got them back. It's funny, after the deal was done, the Saudi minister said, we don't need to call in the divorce lawyers. And so in a little bit, it was like President Trump was a divorce mediator there, bringing them together. So that was unusual. I think what happened, became clear to both Russia and Saudi Arabia. They could put oil into pipelines. They could put oil on tankers, but there was no market for the oil anyway. So you're going to have all this unsold oil. So I think that reality, combined with the determination by the administration to preserve and not lose this tremendous asset of this domestic industry that we have, not have it be destroyed by this, was a very strong, was what kind of brought it all together. But I think it took an awful lot of phone calls to make it happen. If the president is known as a deal maker, this was his mega deal.
Do you think, I guess in all of that, you mentioned President Trump and others in the administration being involved in all that, but there's been a lot of talk here, certainly in Texas, but in other places, about the government getting more involved in the oil and gas business / industry, and there's a tug of war going on between free markets versus help. How do you perceive that debate? How do you think about the issues? You've helped a lot of administrations navigate oil and gas policy. What do you think of the discussion today?
One of the books that I wrote was called The Commanding Heights, and it's about the battle between between government and markets. And I think we're in one of those periods, and it's one of the themes of the new book, the new map that's coming out in a couple of months. And I think when you have a crisis like this in general, you see governments take on a more activist, more interventionist role. I mean, the amount of stimulus that's being poured into the economy is enormous. I think one issue that when OPEC Plus and the U.S. got involved, I think the other countries didn't really understand the President of the United States does not have the power to order all of the thousands and thousands of oil producers in the United States to cut back. So I think that was one feature of the situation. But, I think you have a crisis like this. You have 30 million people unemployed. You're going to have a more activist, engaged government. And at the same time, it's not only an economic crisis, which was the case in the 1930s, but a huge health crisis at the same time. And I think you can say we're still finding our way.
One thing, Dan, you were looking at and experienced previous downturns. We talked about this in the beginning, and in every downturn or in every dark period, people start to think things that ultimately don't become true. One of the things I hear is people are worried about perhaps as the oil industry, changed forever, meaning everything from its desirability to our habits to all kinds of things. What do you think the world looks like 4 or 5 years out? Is oil changed forever, or this gets back to how we should be framing up what happened here?
Well, first, when we're talking about demand destruction, I don't think that's the right term. I think this is a demand contraction. It will uncontract. The question is, how does it uncontract? And there are two different features that will affect it. One is how we live and how we work, the digitalization, what's going to happen to commuting, what's going to happen to business travel. That's certainly a question. The second is the degree of the wounds in the economy. 30 million people unemployed, thousands and thousands of businesses perhaps not surviving. So that's there. And then third is what happens politically, and I think there's a pretty big difference so far we see between the Democrats and the Republicans and their attitude towards the industry. But the reality is there are 276 million automobiles in the United States. They're not going away. So, I think, I've said the factors. I guess the other big factor is, of course, the course that the pandemic itself takes. Is it something that ends? Is it something that comes back in the autumn? Is it mini pandemics that we'll have? And that clearly no one has the answer to that.
Do you think, Dan, CIRA has always done such a good job of bringing the global energy community together, bringing in technology and government and all kinds of players. Do you think the energy debate is going to get better, more honest, more candid, or is it going to continue to be a polarized debate with camps that tend to have pretty rigid views? What's your outlook for the discussion? Because we've definitely seen some polarization in all of this around oil and gas policy.
This was going to be one of the themes of CIRA Week 2020. But Maynard, as you know, and many people watching this know, that with the virus advancing at the speed it was, we had no choice but to cancel the conference for this year. We're looking forward. We're hoping, next year things will be back on a stable ground. I think we're going to hear a lot in this presidential campaign about very different attitudes towards energy. And I think there is there's a pretty deep divide in the country about it. And, middle grounds are harder to find. I mean, look at the battle over pipelines, permitting, and we're going to hear, we already have heard some pretty extreme comments that don't take into account the reality of the nature of our economy and how people move around and how the economy works.
I think those of us in oil and gas country were somewhat hopeful that the country at large would appreciate the jobs and the economic benefit, not to mention the international sort of security dynamic of us having built what we built. But I can't tell that that's true.
I think that is true, what you just described. I don't think it's very well understood. I don't think it's well understood that the supply chains for the U.S. oil and gas industry reach all across the country, that it's been very important in terms of investment, very important for the manufacturing industries of the country. Certainly, we just have doing a new paper where we estimate that the trade deficit would have been over $300 billion higher had it not been for what we've seen in this extraordinary shale revolution. And, it's been important for government revenues, but all of these are not well known and not well communicated.
On this international point, Dan, just kind of circling back a little bit to some of the geopolitics. China, Russia, Saudi, the U.S., those four countries, if you think about their futures over the next 5 to 10 years, it seems like coronavirus and everything that's come with it has greatly altered the outlook for a lot of things. How do you size up those four players and the interactions over the next 5 to 10 years?
Interesting that you pointed to what are four of the main sections in my new book.
Oh, there you go. That was not a setup, I promise.
I know it was not a setup, but in fact, it just turned out to be the case. I think for the U.S., this is clearly, if we look at on the energy side, this has been a big positive. I mean, to see the U.S. went from being on a track to where the only question was how much more oil would we import to where we are today. That's a huge change. I think for Russia, energy figures very much in its entire foreign relations, its effort to reassert itself as a great power. But it also is, it's been talking about it for 20 years. It needs to diversify its economy. China, energy figures, in its basic economic growth strategy. It needs it for growth. It figures in the South China Sea controversy, figures in the Belt and Road. So I think very important there. And then obviously it's central to the future of the Middle East. So energy really does. It's kind of energy and geopolitics are so woven together that these are very thick strands and very important in terms of what our future will look like.
So you are in Washington, Dan. I just kind of have a question for you, sort of an on-the-ground feeling in Washington. It seems like lots of debate, lots of finger-pointing, lots of spending, but it seems rare when someone looks up and talks about the deficit or the debt or just what we're doing to the long-term prospects of the country. Does it feel a little better on the ground than it looks on TV?
No, I think right now it's a crisis where you throw money at this problem, and that's what's happening now. Estimates are over $4 trillion, but I think governments are going to come out of this in a very heavy debt position, and that's going to be a constraint on what they can do in the future. It raises questions about what inflation will be like in the future. Right now I think it's just trying to put out the fire, dealing with this situation. I think one of the things that mentioned, in terms of when we come out of this also, is deepens the divide, the already growing divide between China and the United States. And I think we're going to see more stress on globalization. By that, I mean more tension on globalization, more pressure on it. And I think companies are going to go through a process, as well as countries, of reviewing their supply chains, which one didn't think much about borders. But as a consequence of this, supply chains were not really, they've become an issue in the last couple of years in the States, but I think it's going to be a much bigger issue going forward.
So you mentioned your new book, MAP, I think it's called.
The new map.
The new map.
The new map, and the subtitle is Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations.
And when does that come out? Because everybody's going to want it.
Right. September is the publication. It'll be available on Amazon before then. And, I think people are ordering it now.
And my question was, on the new map, do you think is part of your theme that borders are going to matter more than they have previously? You just made that comment. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I think so. I think, we got pretty accustomed to being able to move very freely in the world. Manufacturing, things could be assembled and built in 10 different countries and come together. But I think now, borders are going to go up. So I think globalization can't go away. Zoom, digital, it's not going to go away. But I think it's going to become more fractured.
So I just have two last questions. You've been very generous with your time, Dan. One is just on forecasting, because as a author and a expert and everything that energy has in it, why do you think we keep missing these big events? Meaning, it could be 9/11, could be this one. Why as a society do we kind of continue to get surprised?
I think there are kind of two reasons. I've always been interested in surprise. And that's why I find real scenarios, not base case and probabilities, but real scenarios, different stories of the future, very valuable, because you take the things that people don't think will happen, and sometimes they really do happen. So I think there are maybe two things. One is, and I remember George Shultz once when I was talking to a former Secretary of State, saying you can think something will happen, but you don't really think it. You can visualize it, but you don't really think it's going to happen. And maybe we would put this pandemic partly in that category. The other is kind of the failure of imagination. And there's a 3-volume history of Pearl Harbor by a man named Gordon Prang. And at the end, he asked the question, why did Pearl Harbor happen? And his conclusion was that just because people didn't imagine that it could happen. And so, unexpected things happen. We'd had other pandemics, but nothing like this since the Spanish flu. And, if you had said, Maynard, in January, anybody watching this, the U.S. is going to shut down because of a virus, you'd say, what? This isn't 1918. This is 2020. It won't happen, but it's happened. So I think it's those two things really making an effort, and if you go 100 years, you don't have a pandemic, global pandemic, you say, well, it's not a big risk. But I think it is, we have to build more sort of insurance and imagination into our thinking.
So I wanted to end on an upbeat note. Mike was telling me that, and I might have this wrong, but Travis Dice on his earnings call today said something like, we go through these things, we survive them, and we ultimately get better. Do you see a positive scenario for the oil and gas industry?
Well, two things. Yeah, I mean, I think you go through this like 2014, 2015, you learn more and you change your operations and you become more efficient. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of damage from this in the industry. But the other thing that strikes me is, the outlook is, I mean, it can change again, but it's really changed since, 2-3 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. It's a combination that cuts by OPEC Plus are happening. Other countries are cutting. We're seeing the shut-ins where companies saying, I'm not going to sell this oil. The storage I'd like to have it in is the storage in the ground, and starting to see, some recovery opening up, demand coming up, looking better. So I think that's what the markets are looking at right now. There's still going to be a lot of pain and difficulty for it. But it's certainly at this point, the outlook is a lot better, and attitudes, thinking, market sentiment, at least as I perceive it, and I know we'll talk about it in a minute, is just kind of shifting as kind of trying to look beyond what happened last month when 30 million barrels a day disappeared from the market. And, when you start to do the numbers, we're looking at 17 million barrels a day of production and cutbacks and so forth. And if some recovery will really help. So I think the outlook does look somewhat better. And obviously, everybody's learned lessons from this.
Well, Dan, we're so lucky to have you as a friend. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to take your last comment on sentiment and jump to Mike Bradley. Mike, Dan was talking about sentiment's improved. Your headline was?
Yeah, crude oil prices have gone a lot further than people thought. We talked about this last week, that physical markets were getting better. And I think we probably, in hindsight, we would like to have gotten more constructive at that point in time. But really what we've had is, we're going through three different phases, I guess, in crude oil. The first phase was, how far is demand going to go down, and when is supply going to match that? And that was, what took price all the way down to where it was. But you know what? Going to negative $40 a barrel was not a physical thing. It was a financial thing. The phase that we're kind of embarking on right now is one where demand is starting to improve, supply cuts are kicking in, and thus, you're seeing time spreads, Brent time spreads are getting tighter, because showing you the physical market is getting tighter. And that to us is a market, not a $15 to $25 market. That's more of a $25 to $35 market. And the third phase that people are trying to struggle with right now is why you're seeing a lot of people getting really concerned that crude's ran a lot and the equities have run a lot. Is okay. What the third phase is, okay, when is supply and demand going to balance, and what does that mean? We're thinking that is a late sort of 2020 type scenario. That's you're going to see, like Dan said, you're going to see cuts of 15 million barrels plus. The question is, where's demand going to come back to? Is it going to be 85 million barrels, 90 million barrels, or 95 million barrels? And that's going to dictate what happens to spreads, how quickly we clean inventories out. And in that environment, we see that as a $35 to $45 scenario. So I think the market right now is struggling, how we get from scenario 2, which we think we're in, to scenario 3. And that's what the big struggle is.
And we think that the independents are discounting what long-term price of oil?
Right now, we're looking at the independents are pricing between $40 and $42 a barrel oil. And if you look at the curve is well below that out to 2024. So there's a dichotomy of who's going to be right and who's going to be wrong at this point in time.
Okay, so not to steal his thunder, but I think that's a little bit of Colin Fenton's thesis, which is the market is pricing in a certain world that might happen. So Colin, let's turn it back to you. Remind us of your headline and then explain it for us.
If you ask Ben Bernanke, what was the great lesson of the Great Depression? What was the great mistake made and the great lesson learned? It was that monetary policy was kept too tight for too long. And obviously that's not the problem today. We have infinite money being promised by central banks. We've already seen a lot of that money get created and dispersed into markets. Certainly not fiscal policy, as Dan just said, with the $4 trillion of promises and seemingly a package, behind every tree. But possibly the mistake that might get made here is with social policy. And we're obviously in a learning process where back in January and February, we could begin to see statistics come in on infection rates, cases known, cases of mortality, and so on. And the one number that we don't really have today is the true infection fatality rate. We can see that there is a great dispersion of mortality on the basis of COVID-19 by age, and that has become something we're learning more and more about. But policy is still kind of a one-size-fits-all policy. And what history has taught us is that if information begins to be in hand, and we still kind of have a fight over reopening framed only in politics and political terms, and don't recognize that there are also social and economic ramifications to whether you reopen or not, then I think that begins to reach into history and say, maybe there's something to be learned here. And I feel like I'm repeating some of the points that Dan made, but I agree with them, 100%. And just to finish the thought, on Friday, we're going to get a pretty nasty, pretty ugly jobs report for the United States. It will be at least 25 million people now reported as unemployed. And I worry that as Texas reopens, and we have many of our friends in TPH Nation who find themselves in this unwanted position of underemployment or anxiety or even unemployment, that we're going to begin to have some of the social distress pressures of watching an economy get back to normal, but your life's not back to normal. And I think that perhaps has been underestimated as an effect. So just looking forward, obviously the equity market and the oil market and even the gas market has got to bounce in its step this week. Certainly there's a lot of reasons to see that in fundamentals. And it is true that we may even have therapeutics and possibly even a vaccine arrive far sooner than the worst case scenario. But I just think that it's important to keep in mind that history has taught us over and over and over again that you have to think in terms of conditional probabilities and cascading effects. And you can't hermetically seal, as much as we would want to, each of these different factors.
But you said one thing that I'll pause on. I'll pluck it out as a positive. I think everybody's been struck by all these overlapping jurisdictions, cities, counties, states, the federal government, groups of states, etc. Your comment about one size does not fit all sort of suggests maybe this patchwork we have might end up being an asset to us as you respond to different situations in different locations.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you mentioned that I'm sitting in Massachusetts today. You're sitting in Texas. Let's just be honest about stuff we don't know. Let's embrace uncertainty. Let's embrace our ignorance about things. Let's try to be sensible about it. Try to make good decisions. And if we do that, I think the outcomes begin to be put into a better spot. I like the way that Dan put it. We're thinking about potential scenarios, not trying to kid ourselves in building probabilities. We can't even answer some of the basic questions about the nature of the disease.
I also thought you did a very wise thing, which is agreeing with Dan Jurgen on an energy show is always a high probability move. It's okay, Matt Portillo, you mentioned a risk in natural gas. Talk to us.
Yeah, sure. I think as we look forward over the next few months, we're starting to wave the yellow flag on natural gas. Really, the caution here actually surrounds the uplift in crude prices. So one of the key tenets of our thesis around natural gas heading into the summer, still staying relatively robust, was that crude prices would likely continue to force operators to shut in production on the crude front. Henry Hub is now trading at a premia to a lot of the global markets, in particular Europe, which is unfortunately a concern for us, as it potentially means we're going to see lower LNG cargo loadings over the next few months. And to put that into context, cargo loadings out of the U.S. averaged about 8.5 BCF. In Q1, we think that we'll see probably something closer to 4 to 5 BCF in June, July, and potentially August. So you have a confluence of things happening here where supply may actually flatline or even grow a bit going into June because crude volumes come back on stream and demand may be declining. That could push natural gas prices down below 2 again. And as we're looking at the summer part of the curve, potentially closer to 175. I think the good thing is nothing is structurally changing in terms of the exit-to-exit declines in the U.S. we're still expecting volumes to structurally roll this year due to lack of capital investment in crude basins. And our 2021 forecast is unchanged at 275 to 3. So really some caution in the near term, but still see some upside to the longer term curve.
Are you surprised, Matt or Colin or Mike, that when we have a little bit of an optimistic play, that money seems to pour into it? Like even in tough times, I mean, we talked about money poured into the oil ETFs, money jumped into gas. Like despite the overall pressures of this world, when something opens up, it seems like money finds it quick.
Well, let's keep in mind how much money we're talking about: trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And so part of the reason you're seeing the equities discount that $40 to $42 price is because that's where the 5-year forward is. And so what's likely to happen is, much as we saw in 2003, we're going to start to see cost push inflation in a range of scenarios where the back end of the curve will begin to lift as the system begins to realize the consequences for the value of the dollar and the consequences for inflation if we do get an economic recovery with this kind of massive liquidity behind it. So, it really begs the question, what is a dollar in the year 2024?
Okay, we're going to have to ask you to answer that one next week, Colin, because that's a meaty one. Anyway, I want to do one thing here. We've asked, as we've done these over the weeks, for communities to tell us when they have something that we could help with. And so just this past week, we heard from some good friends in the Denver area. There's a charity there called A Precious Child. And they're really focused, as it sounds, on helping children, underprivileged children. And they have a real need right now in the COVID crisis to get supplies, cleaning supplies, baby supplies, things like that. So we're going to attach to this week's blast as some information about A Precious Child. We'd encourage everybody to check it out. I think we've all been looking for ways to be helpful, and this looks like a very good one. So as I wrap up, I'll just say thank you to Dan Jurgen again. It's so fantastic to have you. You're a great friend. I don't know what we did to deserve you, but we'll take you. And please.
Maynard, I'm delighted to be able to join you and your colleagues, and as you know, have huge respect for TPH and what you do and your role in the industry. So I was very pleased to jump at the invitation to have this chance to be part of your show.
Well, thank you so much. And Colin, Matt, and Mike, we'll see you tomorrow and next week. Thanks, guys.